Hey guys, today we're going to cover notes 4-6, where we complete proofs for congruent triangles. All right, so for the statements column, that's where we're going to put all the information we know of the triangles. The very first information is given here. It says L is the midpoint of segment KN and segment MP. And so the reason would be where we have to justify it. How do we know that? Well, it's given. So it looks like that's all it gave us. But because L is the midpoint of KN, so L is right in the middle of this whole side, therefore the distance from K to L is the same as the distance from L to N. So those two segments are congruent. How do we know that? Well, that's definition of midpoint. Now the same is for MP. So the distance from M to L is going to be the same as from L to P, because L is right in the middle of that whole segment. So those two segments are congruent. And the reason is the same. It's because of definition of midpoint. So here I actually put what midpoint was in case you forgot. So it's a point in the middle of a line segment, in this case B. So because B is in the middle, then the distance from A to B is the same as the distance from B to C. So it creates two congruent segments. We also know that we have the kissing angles, which are the vertical angles, and we know those are congruent. So we have angle MLK is congruent to angle NLP. And how do we know that? And you can just put vertical angles. So lastly, we know that triangles MKL and PNL are congruent by side, angle, side. All right, for number 2, it tells us that segment BD bisects angle ABC. So that means that it's cutting angle ABC into two congruent angles. So that angle is the same as that one. So an angle bisector, it's a line that divides an angle. So here, let's say I have this angle. So here I have the line or line segment that's cutting that angle in half into equal pieces. All right, for my statements on number 2, I went ahead and wrote the first two that were actually given. Okay, and then because we talked about the angle bisector, I know that angle ABD is congruent to angle CBD. And again, because that was definition of an angle bisector. I also know that BD is congruent to itself. So that segment goes to both triangles, right? Because of reflexive property, a side is always congruent to itself. And I think I forgot to fill this in. Number 2, where we put angle BAD is congruent to BCD. So those two are the same right there. And so lastly, we have triangle ABD is congruent to CBD by angle, angle, side. So we would put AAS. All right, so for number 3, it actually gives us 3 of the statements. We know that S is the midpoint of QU. We have those two sides are congruent and those two sides are congruent. So now that I wrote it down, I'm going to go to my picture and label everything that was congruent. So QR and TS were congruent. RS and TU are congruent. And then because S is the midpoint of QU, I know that QS is the same as SU. So my reasoning would be because of definition of midpoint. So lastly, I know that these two triangles are congruent by side, side, side. All 3 sides are the same for both of them. For number 4, we have 2 statements that are given. We have right triangles, and then it tells us which 2 sides are the same. And actually, if you look at the picture, it tells you which 2 angles are the same. So we have 3 given statements. So there are my 3 given statements. And it also looks like segment FH, this side, is congruent to both triangles by reflexive property. So these triangles would be congruent by hypotenuse leg. So these are all the reasons I have so far as to how you would prove that either sides are congruent or angles are congruent. So you can just pause this if you need a minute to look at it. All right, for number 5, I'm going to go ahead and list those 2 statements that it already gives me. So it tells me that KL is parallel to NP, and it also tells me that they're congruent. So they're the same length and they're parallel. Because they're parallel, So we talked a lot about the z. Okay, we can form a z, therefore those angles would be congruent. And there's actually two z's I could have formed. I could have also done the backwards z, so done k and p. So here's the last thing. Remember that when it forms a z, what they're really called is alternate interior angles. They're on alternate sides of the transversal, and I pointed out what the transversal was. And they're also both inside of the parallel line. So again, alternate interior angles are when it forms the z. So if you need a minute to pause this video, so we really have 5 things we're working with here. And these are all reasons as why either sides or angles would be congruent. So going back to our problem, we said angle L was congruent to angle N, and the reason for that, it's because they're alternate interior angles. And I put at the end there in quotation, so that's when it forms the Z. We also know that we have vertical angles. So I said angle KML is congruent to angle NMP. So lastly, these two triangles would be congruent by angle side. For number 6, what I came up with is that we didn't need this last part right here. So go ahead and cross out that row. I'm going to go ahead and list the 2 things that it already gave me as my first 2 statements. All right, so I know that the length from T to Y is the same as the length from X to Y. So those 2 are the same, and it also told me that angle TVY is congruent to angle XWY. So those 2 are the same. Remember that I'm comparing the 2 little triangles and not the big ones that are overlapping. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight which 2 triangles I'm comparing. So the last piece of information that I would write is that I have the vertical angles. And really, that's all the information I need because these triangles would be congruent by angle side. So again, I think that last part was a mistake. I don't think that was meant to be there. So guys, remember that this is all the same stuff we've been doing, except the only thing with proofs is you're literally justifying everything. How do you know that the sides are congruent? How do you know that the angles are congruent? So everything has a reason as to why it is the way it is. So I hope this video was helpful, guys. Thanks for watching.